Quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your certified flight instructor, aircraft manuals, and current regulations before applying any of the techniques or interpretations discussed here.
Hello and welcome to Helicopter Train Podcast Episode 3. In this special episode, we're going to do things a little differently as we're going to be sharing part 1 of a conversation I recorded with Max Trescott for the Rotary Wing Show on dangerous student errors. More on that in a bit. In case you missed the last episode, episode 2, that was a deep dive into hovering where we were covering things like what each control does in a hover and how, all the complex aerodynamics involved in hovering, the FAA ACS hover standards, some hover practice drills and tips and tricks for both students and instructors. So check that one out if you're learning or teaching hovering. And the episode before that, episode 1, that was covering what you need to know if you're interested in becoming a helicopter pilot. Such things as training paths, certifications, age, medical and education requirements, as well as how to choose the right flight school and the training helicopter. Options for financing, how to get started, including free and cheap ways to begin studying on your own before you start at a flight school. So if you're thinking about getting into helicopters or you know someone who's interested, definitely check that episode out or pass it along. Since the last episode, I've been busy as usual at the flight school I help run. We've just hired 3 new instructors and I've started them on their training. One of the great things about the flight school I'm at is they really invest in their instructors. The training program includes about 4 days of ground school and 5 or 6 flights in the R-22. 2 of them are pretty much all finished up. I've got 1 more to finish wrapping up in the R-22. And then next on the list is their R-44 transition training. On top of that, there's all the usual 6-month standardization flights, stage check training, advanced maneuver training. All that goes into our current instructors over their 2 years with us. I'm also working on some new simulator scenarios for our updated instrument training course, so I'm busy as ever. I also volunteer with the Rotorcraft Collective, which is a joint FAA industry initiative that produces short educational videos to help reduce helicopter accident rates. Lately, I've been working on a few of the newest scripts and creating some B-roll content. We're currently in the phase of recording the presenters and voiceovers for several videos at once, and then the editing will kick off after that. It'll likely be a month or 2 before the next releases, but in the meantime, check out the Rotorcraft Collective's YouTube playlist to see what's already available. And finally, I was invited over the mountains to a Robinson fly-in at Jerry Trimble Helicopters. My boss at the Portland FAA safety team asked if I'd be interested in giving a safety presentation at the event. I took my dangerous student errors training program that I do with the new hire instructors at our flight school and adapted it into a presentation that tied in recent training accidents and made the material more accessible for a wider audience. More on that in a minute. As always, it was a great event and a good chance to connect with pilots and instructors on that side of the hills. McMinnville is also a fantastic place to visit for the Air and Space Museum and a pretty impressive water park. Definitely worth a visit if you're in Oregon. Since the last episode, I also received an audio feedback from Beck in Australia. She's got such a great attitude, and I wanted to share it with listeners who are in flight training because sometimes the process can feel a bit like a slog. It can really get you down and you lose focus. But what Beck shares is a good reminder to take some pressure off yourself and enjoy the journey of becoming a helicopter pilot.
Hey guys, firstly I just wanted to say thank you so much for your YouTube channel. I've been watching your videos. My name's Beck. I'm a Kiwi living in Australia and I've just started my training in an R-22. I'm only 4 hours in, and one thing I'm actively doing is just not putting any pressure on myself to get things straight away. Even simple things that I feel like I was on top of before hitting the skies. So yeah, I'm just giving my brain a lot of grace because I'm recognizing it's under a heavy load. And I'm actually finding that seemingly randomly, when my brain cools off, things just click. So that's good. The second thing is that I've always wanted to fly since I was really little. So to finally get into the seat is unreal. However, like everything in life, I've learned to make sure not to have any picture in my mind of how this journey is meant to go. And I'm just letting myself experience it all instead. So that way I'm not controlled by some picture in my head that actually isn't based in reality. I'm just having an adventure and experiencing it without disappointment and frustration, which makes it just fun. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because that's kind of, it's freedom. And yeah, thanks again for your channel and good luck and all the best to everybody else out there that's learning.
I think that's great advice. So just before recording, I checked in with Beck. She's just over 15 hours in and progressing well. Her instructor says she's right on track. She learned to hover around 5 hours, or as the Australian mustering pilots say, she was kissed by the hover fairy. The weather in Camden, Australia has caused a lot of cancellations, which I would caution anyone getting into flight training. That's kind of the way it goes sometimes, just roll with it. And instead of sitting idle, she used her time to broaden her experience. She toured the local air traffic control tower, which really boosted her radio confidence, and even got hands-on with a supervised 50-hour oil change on the aircraft. None of that's required in training, but it really helps build a more rounded pilot. I recommend any student to try and get a tower tour and connect with maintenance to learn more about the aircraft you fly. Great job, Beck. Thanks, Beck, for sharing that. Stay in touch with your progress. So if anyone else wants to send in feedback or questions for the show, either as a written message or record a quick audio message, head over to helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. And before we move on, a huge thank you to the YouTube members and Patreon supporters who are helping keep helicopter training videos and the podcast going. Most recent supporters are Robert, Mohammed, Novi, and Mark. And since the last episode, I also received a generous PayPal donation from Gregory in Houston, Texas, who's working on his instrument rating. Thank you very much, and the best of luck with that rating, Gregory. For anyone interested in supporting this project financially or otherwise, check out the show notes for links and more info, or visit helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/support. The main content of this episode is part one of a 3-part conversation I had with Max Trescott for the Rotary Wing Show. I've been talking to Max about the FAA safety team presentation I did over at McMinnville, and Max invited me onto the Rotary Wing Show to talk about dangerous student errors that we see in helicopter training and pass the advice on to an even wider audience. My hope is that both instructors and students will find this discussion eye-opening and practical for keeping helicopter training safe. In this first part, I'll be covering some general advice as well as a few maneuver specifics. If you haven't heard of Max before, he's an award-winning, safety-focused fixed-wing flight instructor with over 12,000 hours and more than 25 years instructor experience. He's also a commercial-rated helicopter pilot. Max brings in-depth analysis, practical advice, and great guest perspectives to both fixed-wing and rotary wing aviation. I highly recommend checking out the Rotary Wing Show and the Aviation News Talk podcasts. He also co-hosts the NTSB News Talk podcast, which analyzes recent accidents with Rob Mark. And if that wasn't enough, somehow he finds time for another show, UAV News Talk, which covers all things drone-related. And he's also the author of several books on Garmin avionics. You can find links to all this in the show notes. Also, in this version of the discussion, I've added various visuals, diagrams, and video examples. So if you're listening and things don't make sense, you can view the visual version on podcast apps that support video, or you can check out the video podcast version on Helicopter Training Video's YouTube channel. Now, let's get into part one of Dangerous Student Errors on the Rotary Wing Show with Max Trescott. Okay, let's get started.
Jay, welcome to the show. So good to have you here today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Well, you do great work, and so that's part of the reason we want to have you on the show. So you, for example, recently gave a presentation, and you were talking about, I think you called it dangerous student errors. Tell us about how you learned about all these errors and the value of things like SMS, CFI meetings, and accident reports.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was an FAA safety team meeting at a Robinson fly-in in Oregon, and the FAA safety team had asked me as an FAA safety team rep to talk about this. This is something that I started looking at probably about 10 years ago when I was an instructor first time around, instructor 1.0. And we had a simulator that was used for the typical things, instrument training mainly. And as I progressed becoming a more senior instructor, I realized there was some value in using that simulator to put together some of the scarier things that we see in flight instruction and helicopters. And so the first version of that kind of sort of existed unofficially back then, and I worked with a few other instructors to kind of new instructors to help them with that. And fast forward about 10 years or so, I come back to help run the flight school again, and we now made it part of our new hire training to run through a formal dangerous student error training program in the simulator. And over the last 4 or 5 years that I've been there, we've been kind of building up that catalog of the things that we go through based on a few things. The stories we hear from the instructors or I experience myself, along with our formal SMS safety management system reporting of events or hazards that have happened. That's been a great source for improving training and standards and everything else. And then we also have things like unscheduled maintenance. Something's gone into maintenance because a thing happened, and we trace it back to, what's the root cause there? Well, it was because the student did this. So it's not just, when I say dangerous student errors, it's not to the extreme of the aircraft crashed and everyone died. It's from that all the way up to an event that caused an overspeed. That's pretty typical in auto rotation training in light helicopters like the R-22. That's damage to the airframe. It may not be damage to the people, but that's also stuff that we can cover in the simulator, and which we can't safely do for the most part in the helicopter. So that's kind of the other thing about where we get the what can happen stories is from all the usual NTSB, ATSB, all the other agencies that other countries have for investigating accidents, which have obviously gone to usually an extreme of someone getting hurt.
Yeah, and I guess the primary outcome of all of this is that you're using this information to train your flight instructors at the flight school, and that's going to be helpful for people who are listening today who are flight instructors, but also for people who are flying themselves.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's value for the student that's going to be an instructor. There's the value for the instructor, obviously. There's the value for students who don't want to make these mistakes unknowingly. And that, whether you're 20 hours or 200 hours, these mistakes happen. I think that's, I talk about students making mistakes is part of the job description, really, for being a student. You're going to make mistakes. And even when you're a certified pilot, you make mistakes. Some of the strongest memories, the most powerful learning happens where these mistakes happen. We just need to make sure it's a learning moment and not an accident report or an incident report. And that's really what this training is about, is trying to block for that kind of thing and still allow a student to learn from mistakes, safe mistakes, and to sort of be a little bit more looking ahead about what could happen and kind of how to block for that.
Right. So no matter how many thousands of hours we have in a helicopter, we still make mistakes. And so it's helpful to review all these kinds of things. And the nice thing I like about SMS, safety management systems, is that it helps pick up things that might lead to an accident so that you can try and eliminate those things before they become accidents. Yeah,
absolutely. We really encourage our instructors, if they intervened with something and they stopped it before it became an incident, think about if they weren't there. That's one of the triggers for us. Or if they think, is that something I should report? If you're thinking about it, just report it. And when then I'm part of the safety committee as well at the flight school, and I get all these safety reports. And every month I go through them and put them into our instructor monthly meeting, which actually we have one on Monday. We'll talk about what happened. We never, take away the names of the details of the specifics, but what could we learn from this? And where needed, we put it into our ops manual or our training or the dangerous student errors. Yeah, I think SMS, it is another thing is it sounds like paperwork and telling on yourself. That's the wrong attitude to see it. It's a way for us all to learn and not keep these little secrets, and we can all learn because we all make mistakes.
Right. Definitely, it's an early warning system. Well, I'm curious, and I'm sure others are, scale for us the size of the flight school that you work at, number of helicopters, students, instructors.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably sort of medium to large size. We have fixed wing and rotor wing. I work mainly on the rotor wing side. I work on both sides, but as a flight instructor and working with the new instructors, helping them through their training, it's mainly on the rotor wing side. So we have 6 R-22s, 2 R-44s currently up, and a Bell 206 that's used for turbine transition and that kind of stuff. On the fixed wing side, I think they have about 20 planes or something like that. I lose track, but so it's a pretty good size. And I think we have somewhere between 75 to 100 active rotor wing students and instructors, looking somewhere between 15 and 20 flight instructors. And it's very typical. They'll spend, a year and a half to 2 years with us and get to about 1,000 hours and move on to the next stage in their career.
Excellent. Well, I guess one of the first things all flight instructors need to learn about is guarding the controls. Tell us about that. What should they know?
Yeah, so there's what I call resting CFI pose, which is it's a very rare state for an instructor to be. And that's where they're going to have their right hand on their knee. Their left hand is going to be down on the collective, just sensing what's going on with the throttle and making sure there's no big movements, and maybe their feet away from the pedals on the floor. That's a very rare state to be with a brand new student, especially. In fact, probably never there.
And so, I'm guessing that's only when you're at high altitude and probably
away from the ground. Yeah. And that depends on the student you're working with, the conditions. There's so many sort of variables about when you'd be moving away from that resting position and into more of an active guarding position. And so some of the general considerations are the student, what their experience level is. Are they new to you? That should obviously increase your guard a little bit. What are the conditions? Is it windy? Is it gusty? Is there rain? Even rain will affect your depth perception. Is it high density altitude? With the high DA, the aircraft doesn't perform so well. The rotor RPM moves much faster. Are you close to a nice flat surface, or are you operating off airport where you're more likely to hit something and get a dynamic rollover? How busy is the traffic? Are you getting consumed with all this traffic talk, and your situational awareness is being degraded a little bit? So, and then of course your own personal experience level and fatigue. I think that's a really important thing to remember. You don't have the same calm level when you shouldn't. When you're fatigued, you should realize you're going to take a little bit longer to respond and kind of build the extra buffer in. And then it goes into the specifics of what is the maneuver we're working on, and that's something we'll talk about in a minute. And it's also, I think, with the sort of going back to the general guarding, you have to remember that an instructor who's constantly got their hand right around that cyclic, you're obviously safe because you're basically flying the aircraft, but that's not what we need for a student to be able to feel what the aircraft's doing, to fly the aircraft. So you have to kind of find that balance. We can talk if you want, real quickly about some of the general considerations of each control.
Yes, please.
So I think let's start with the pedals. I would say in certain maneuvers, you should certainly have both feet close to the pedals. And that would be a general good starting position for a lot of the hover work. And we'll cover some of the more specific stuff. Once you are up at altitude, again, we talked about it may be safe to bring your feet away. That's usually a relatively low risk maneuver, forward flight, as far as the pedals go. Students are very rarely going to be stomping pedals when you're in forward flight. And if they do, it's a relatively low risk for them to do that. I will also say, going back to the hover work though, even as you become more relaxed with the student, their level progresses and you've got reasonable level of experience with them. When I slow down, when I come close to sort of hover speeds, it doesn't matter who I'm flying with, I'll be bringing my left foot up close over the pedal. And we're talking about Robinson product here with the counter rotating. It would obviously be opposite for Cabri, rotating the other way. Because what I don't want to happen is for the aircraft to start powering up, the torque reaction starting to kick in, and the student getting late on that left pedal to stop that right yaw. So I always, as we slow down, start to bring my left foot up. And then, during hovering, if it's hover training, I'm usually with both feet. But so then there are also times where we want to do what's called a right brace, a right leg brace, where we're holding the right foot and locking our leg so that if the student who is supposed to push their right pedal in certain maneuvers, hover autos, order entries, if they do try to push the left pedal, they're going to push the left pedal in, the right pedal moves up and hits our foot, and we block that movement. We also sense that feeling and can immediately use that as a trigger to push through onto the right to stop. It's probably going to be a yaw, an unwanted yaw. Again, we'll get into the specifics when we get to those maneuvers. Let's move on to the collective, though. I think with the collective, so our left hand as an instructor should really live down there on the collective, a very loose. I just have my thumb on the side of the chair, and I just have my hand kind of draped over the throttle in the collective. And so we're generally, if we're not talking about any particular maneuver that we're blocking against, we should just be feeling that the collective's going up and down in the direction that we expect it to go and when we expect it to go. And then when we get to the throttle, The throttle, there's a little bit more going on with the throttle. We always want to be, as a pilot, we should be monitoring a throttle of something like an R22 or an R44. The governor assists the pilot, but the pilot has to be following along to know what's going on and be ready to override it. Governors fail, they go high-low, they go erratic. So we always have a hand there. But as the instructor, we need to be quite close on that throttle. And I call this like 3 or 4 ways we can do that generally. The first is a very loose grip. We're holding thumb and 2 fingers, and we're just letting that throttle move under our hand. And that's normal for a pilot or a student should have that kind of monitoring grip. The next level up, I would say, is when actually I have a throttle grip here for those of you that are watching. I actually have a throttle grip that came off a helicopter today, so I grabbed it. Then we have a full hand grip on the throttle and a loose grip still. So we're still letting the throttle move. And at this point, we're being a little bit more proactive about being ready to overgrip the throttle. But the problem with this grip, or lack of grip, this kind of loose grip over it, is if the student does make a big movement on the throttle and you clamp down, the time it takes for your skin to take that looseness out of your skin and create that friction, it can already be a little bit too late for an overspeed or an underspeed event. So there's limited use on that grip technique. The next level is what I call a strong grip, or you might hear a death grip. Right? And a death grip is a bad thing for a student to do. We can talk about that later. But for an instructor, a strong grip means that you have your hand already gripped around the throttle, but you must have a loose wrist. And that way the throttle can still move as it's supposed to, either through the governor action or the student doing whatever they're supposed to be doing. But you've already taken out all the slop in your grip, so that the moment that the student goes too far or the wrong way, or throttle chops you or whatever it is, what you do is you just lock your wrist, and it makes a much quicker, faster way to hold that throttle tight and take control of the throttle, as opposed to loosely holding over the throttle and letting it run underneath your hand. And then the last kind of throttle grip technique that we talk about is an underhand grip, or sometimes called a fingernails up grip, where you already have your hand twisted around the throttle so that it can only roll one way, which would be typically rolling the throttle off for an auto entry or a hover auto. So those are the 4 levels of grip for an instructor on the throttle. And then the last control being the cyclic. I also have kind of a color system of progression of cyclic guarding, I suppose. At the very bottom level is we're not guarding at all. We have our right hand on our thigh, and that's okay in certain situations, of course. But when we need to start paying attention to the cyclic and guarding, I have a color code system of green, yellow, and red. And green would be bringing your hand up and having it just open but close to the cyclic. So it won't take much for you to take the control, and it won't take much for you to block in most directions. And we'll cover in certain maneuvers where that might be the right grip, or the right block, I should say. The next level up I call a yellow level of cyclic blocking, and that's where you actually, you kind of have a closed grip around the cyclic, but you're not holding the cyclic. A pen might be a better example because it's not as thick. So you can see it would still allow the cyclic to move, but within pretty defined boundaries. So the student shouldn't feel you on the controls, but you're there to be able to block. As you know, the cyclic is extremely sensitive. We're talking pressure more than movement for many maneuvers. So it's a pretty generous amount of movement still. The next level would be, I'd call it the red level of cyclic, and that's really where you are all the way around. When you get to that point, you really need to communicate to the student that they are still flying, and you're helping them, you're nudging or you're guarding. So they need to understand this is not the time for them to let go of the control, because that's not what you're doing here. You're just being close enough that you can make instantaneous adjustments. Hover training typically would be kind of initial hover training. Might be doing that kind of work with a cyclic with them. And then there's a couple of like modified versions of the sort of more yellow grip, where you might have what I call a U-shaped grip, where you may have your hand close to the back of the cyclic but open at the front. And so we know the risk in certain maneuvers is that they're going to come too quickly back on the cyclic, and we're just blocking close on the backside and relatively loose on the either side. And we can also do something similar where we put our hand in a U shape, but covering the front and back. We're just making sure that would be forward flight, for example. A brand new student, they're given the cyclic, you've explained over and over how sensitive it is, and you give the controls, and almost immediately they're going to start diving the nose back and forth. And you want to be nice and close to help them, help guide them through that. But so those are the generic, what I call the general blocking and guarding of controls.
Now, you use a phrase called ghosting the maneuver. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is another sort of generic technique where certain maneuvers where if the student's doing something, you have time to look at what they're doing, work out what they're doing, tell them what they need to do differently. They hear it, they process it, and hopefully they do the right thing. And if they don't, you still have time to fix. And there's certain maneuvers where that is not all at all possible, where we're talking about very time sensitive, low safety tolerance for mistakes, certain maneuvers like hover autos, auto entries, recovery from the vortex ring state with a lateral recovery, quick stop slopes, where the instructor needs to be thinking about how they are actually doing the maneuver themselves. And I don't mean doing the maneuver. I don't mean them actually doing it physically and pushing the controls, but being in their mind, sitting up straight. This is how I would do this maneuver as it happens. So the moment there's a deviation, they don't have to process what just happened. They just know that's not how I would do it. And they can take the controls and continue the maneuver as it should be. Robinson have a lot of great safety notices, but one they have, it's safety notice 27, is talking about surprise throttle chops, for example. And they have some good little bits of advice in there. But one of the things that they say is never wait to see what the student does and always assume that you will be the one completing that entry into the auto. And that's the kind of the mindset you have to be in. And it takes a few, we do it with the instructors, and we do a couple of pretty scary student errors, and they miss them. And they say, I don't even know what just happened there. And I said, well, that's my point of ghosting is don't think about what just happened. Just understand it's gone beyond what you would have done. Too much, too little, wrong direction, whatever it is. Guard, block, my controls if necessary. And that's generally a good thing. I'd say if someone does something that's completely opposite or the wrong maneuver entry or whatever it is, probably best just go straight to my controls, because even if you manage to corral them back into, maybe it was an auto entry where they throttle chopped you on entry or something like that, their mind's now thinking, what did I just do? What did I just do? Instead of flying the maneuver, right? So I think when we get a lot of these misfires, or I call them brain farts, where a student is in a stressful situation of a maneuver that maybe they're a little bit scared of or is new to them, and their brain reaches out and grabs something, the wrong thing, and does it. And we just take the controls. Take the controls, give them a breather. Let's talk about what are we doing here? What is the maneuver? What should we do? I mean, I've done plenty of times in the aircraft as well as in the sim where I'll do an error and the instructor uses this technique, and my controls, they take the controls, and I say, what did the student do wrong there? I don't know. I said, good, because the focus is taking the controls, not trying to process what just happened. You had the right priority there. This is what I actually did. And they're like, oh, well, I see that now. But yeah.
So back in episode 118, which was just a couple of weeks ago, we had Richard Mornington Sanford on, and he talked about a story with a student who froze up on the controls, and you contacted me and said that that really resonated with you. Talk about freezing up on the controls and what you teach CFIs about that.
Yeah. Locking up on the controls or freezing on the controls. It happens. I wouldn't say it's like a lot of these errors aren't what I would call common errors that you find in the Helicopter Flying Handbook or the ACS under common errors. These are the uncommon errors, but they are the dangerous errors, especially if a student locks up, say, on the end of an auto rotation in the flare or entry or recovery of a vortex ring state, that kind of stuff. So we do a couple of things. We do student locking up in the sim to kind of get them into it, and then we do a couple in the aircraft as well with certain maneuvers. And what we teach the instructor is they're typically sat in the left-hand seat, and they have the add-on on the cyclic for the instructor controls, which actually is, if you look at it, as a slightly longer bar. So you have more leverage from the left side on the T-bar than on the other side. And you can use that leverage. You can put your hand on top of the cyclic bar and you can pull it down using the pivot point of the T-bar. And you have to be careful, and that's why we do it in training, to make sure you don't push it forward or push it back. Just come straight down using that pivot point to pull the cyclic out of the student's hand, or at least wake them up as you're elbowing them at the same time and shouting my controls. I know there's been a few accidents that have been attributed to this, and I think it's a fun part of the training, because they're laughing a little bit, that we're role playing a little bit. I'm playing this student that's not letting go, and they feel a little bit awkward shouting at me and elbowing me, and I'm like, please do it. Do it now, so you're prepared for when it happens, if it happens. Yeah.
And my control. Takes a little bit getting used to it. It does, yeah. Back to me.
Yeah, and we talked about auditory exclusion, which is when people are feeling stress and they literally can't hear. And so you need to do other things like touch them, elbow them, cover their eyes, do something just to kind of break them out of that, that deer in the headlights look that they have and that grip on the controls. So let's talk about some maneuvers. Let's start with the beginning, pickup and set downs. What do you teach your CFIs about those?
Yeah, so the main concern on a pickup would be dynamic rollover. And we don't want to bring the aircraft up and yank the thing over, pivot over on a skid and trash the helicopter. So it goes back to the color coding guard. Depends on where your student is, what terrain you're working with, the winds, all those variables. Brand new student, you're going to be right there. You're going to be on the controls. A little bit further along, you're going to be more of an open guard. Always be ready to lower the collective. We know that's the antidote for dynamic rollover, right? But preload your brain. If this starts going pear-shaped, what am I going to do? I'm going to lower that collective, as well as obviously getting the cyclic in as best you can. I would also say always be close on the pedals. I have a little story about this. I told you that I tended to bring my left foot up as we get slower, and no matter what I'm at, what level I'm working with, to stop that right yaw. And some instructors, if they're comfortable with that student, they may keep their feet on the pedal, off the pedals on the floor, on pickup and set down. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen and heard enough stories, and I have a picture that I've sent you of on the blacktop where you can see these spiral markings on the floor where this aircraft has spun, and the skid shoes have left a reminder. So what is happening is the students can get their left and right momentarily misfiring. The nose starts to go. Typically when you're setting down, for example, you're reducing the amount of torque, and you have too much left pedal in, and so the aircraft will tend to yaw left as you lower, and you need to put in some right pedal. If the student gets that backwards, and this can happen to any student, but I think students that have worked heavy equipment where maybe they've been using what we call a track steer, where they push right to run the track forward on the right side, which turns it left. Well, anyway, if the nose starts going left and they push left thinking that's solving the problem, but it speeds it up, so they think, I need more left to fix this, and then they stamp full left. It will spin round 7 times before the instructor's even got their feet off the floor. And I know that for a fact, because this is some of the stories I've heard and seen the evidence of in the flight school. So my advice to instructors, when you're picking up and setting down, no matter the level of student, both feet close to those pedals, you're going to get a nasty wake up one day. Otherwise, it's happened.
Yeah, I can't even imagine having my feet close to the floor doing lift up and set down. I want them to be guarding pretty close to the pedals. Now, you mentioned an accident that occurred in which a low-time CFI was teaching his son, a 13-year-old boy. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I did a bit of research for the presentation I did with the FAST team to pull out some of the latest Robinson or light helicopter specific accidents involved in training where the students had made these errors. And there was an accident that happened in 2022 up in Washington. The CFI, like you said, was relatively low hours. They'd only given about 30 hours of dual instruction, and they were teaching their 13-year-old son to fly. It was his third flight, which I think that's great that he was teaching his son. Unfortunately, as the son was picking up and on grass, they came backwards and they dug the back of the skid in, spun the aircraft round, and rolled over. And the NTSB was basically delayed response by the CFI, resulting in dynamic rollover. But there's a few lessons there. One is that would be a great time to use that U-shaped guard, at least where you're guarding the back, because we never want to come backwards in a hover close to the ground or when we're picking up. So that would have helped with that. I think the other big part of this, though, was operating on grass. Grass is very unforgiving for aircraft moving backwards or sideways. If you're on nice smooth blacktop, you would get away with a skid sliding a little bit. The grass will dig in. I think there was another picture I sent you where there was an R-44 and they were doing hover training above grass, and they came back and the stinger, the guard on the bottom of the tail rotor, hit the ground and instantly dug into the grass and snapped off. Luckily, the tail rotor didn't hit the ground, but the effect was all the way up through the vertical stabilizer, and the tail boom had little wrinkles. So it was obviously quite an expensive mistake. So if you can, practice hovering over a nice smooth surface, blacktop or concrete or something like that.
Talk a little bit about overspeeds during liftoff. I got to say, as a low-time helicopter pilot, that's not something that I'd given a lot of thought to.
Yeah, so the I don't know, I'll just explain real quickly how the correlator works in the R-22 and the R-44. And other helicopters too that have kind of this, piston helicopters that have this assistance to the pilot. The idea is that as you raise the collective, you're going to increase the amount of drag in the rotor system as the blades take more bite of the air. So as the angle of attack increases or the pitch angle increases, the correlator correlates the collective position with opening the throttle to ballpark figure maintain RPM somewhat where it should be. The trouble is these correlators are not perfect. They don't work through the entire range from collective flat down all the way up to pickup. So if you take the R-22, which also has, or an R-44, which also has an electronic governor, if you turn that governor off or it malfunctioned and you are flying what we call manually manipulating the throttle, you would raise, you're on the ground right now, flat pitch, the engine's running, we're already at 100%. You would raise the collective and the correlator would over-correlate, and it would bring the engine and rotor up into the red zone, overspeed, damage to the engine and rotor. So a pilot that was used to flying manually would be rolling the throttle down a little bit. And if your listeners fly the R-22 or the R-44, next time you pick up, just feel and focus, keep it safe, eyes outside, but focus on what the throttle is doing. The governor is backing the throttle off a little bit as you raise. So if your student is stressed and your instructor doesn't look down at their hand grip and make sure they don't have that death grip, that they have that nice loose grip, if they have a stressed death grip on the throttle, it will stop that governor backing off the throttle. And it will cause an overspeed. They'll come up and up will come the engine and rotor. And as the instructor, if you're just got your left hand on the throttle, you won't feel them roll up. They're not rolling up. It's the correlator that's doing it. They're not allowing the governor to roll down. So a couple of things that Robinson talk about is they have a safety nurse 36, which is called Overspeeds during liftoff. They talk about making sure that the governor is on. Some schools will teach that while you've got the RPMs down, turn the governor off, so there's no way that it will go up to the 80% and go into the governed range. So they say, turn the governor off where you're on the ground, low RPM. That's fine. But if you do that, you've got to make sure that you turn that governor back on before you roll above 80 or go up to 100, because it's the same thing. It doesn't matter what you're doing with the grip there. If you turn the governor off, it won't back off and you'll raise up. But the other thing they talk about is inexperienced pilots most likely to be nervous or distracted, particularly susceptible to gripping too firmly during liftoff, and it'll put the engine above 120%. It'll put it off the scale. It'll destroy the engine, and the transmission, the rotor head, the blades. That's an really expensive mistake. So don't do that.
It's so funny as you were talking about some of the nuances and the subtleties of this. I'm reminded of something I had seen recently posted on Reddit where a woman had said, "My husband thinks that he could land a helicopter without flying lessons." And I was thinking, these people truly don't understand how complex these things are.
Well, he might be able to land it. It just might not be flyable again once he's done it. So.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's certainly always our goal. In
Yeah.
addition to walking away, we'd like to be able to use the aircraft again.
Yeah. It's non-disposable aircraft. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about slopes. What should pilots and flight instructors know about those?
I think that most pilots and instructors have a pretty healthy respect for slope operations. They know that is relatively high risk for dynamic rollover. We are deliberately landing this aircraft on something that's uneven, and we're going to have to spend a little bit of time on a single skid, and that's got all the pieces ready to go. We've got a pivot point, we've got power enough to hold the aircraft in hover. The last piece for a dynamic rollover is the rolling motion, which can happen easily with a cyclic input that's incorrect. So I think generally instructors are pretty close to the controls, especially the cyclic there. But this goes back to pre-briefing and verbally briefing with the student. If we get caught up, do not yank that collective up away from the ground. That's the worst thing you can do. If we get caught up, we're just going to lower it down, or we'll stay where we are for a second and we'll work this out. When a lot of places where we're teaching slopes might be at the airport environment, off to one side of a taxiway, which typically has gravel and things like that in. So if we are on that one skid and we're trying to teach the student to hold it and have control of the aircraft before we let it down, if there's a lot of yawing around and moving around, we can start digging ourselves into the ground and creating a ditch, if you like, which increases the chance. So making sure we're paying attention to that, the instructor and the student clearing the skid when we come to pick it up again, make sure we haven't dug a huge ditch there. And I also remember we were looking for a maximum of 5 degrees. That's nothing. It's really nothing. We're not doing a heli ski drop off on the side of putting a toe in, and it's pretty mellow in the training environment. We just need to land with one skid down first before the other. That's a slope. That's what we're looking for. Saying that, the R22 tends to sit low left skid, so it often is quite easy to train with the left skid making contact first. That's fine. Just make sure you're teaching your students to do right skid down first as well as left skid down. Don't get them only learning that maneuver one way. When they go to an off airport, the landing may not accommodate that memory that they have of only landing left skid down first. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. Almost all of my training prior to doing my commercial was with either the left side low or the right side low. When I went to do some of the commercial training, we actually did slopes where it was higher in front of us or higher in back of us. So that's another dimension to think about for slope training as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then that tends to naturally happen in off airport training where we're out of that kind of sterilized environment of the gravel's always this way. And now we're putting it down wherever we're putting it down. Let's see what we're dealing with here. But I think there's a lot of training to the test, right? We know we have to do a slope. It's typically going to be one side or the other. Although actually a lot of DPs also will just take the off airport. If it's not a perfectly flat landing, that'll count for the slope. So it goes kind of what you said, not just doing the left, but do the right, do the nose up, make them comfortable in all these different slope landings.
Yeah, and I got to fly a VR simulator with Loft Dynamics, and they actually had slopes built into that, so it was pretty easy to do any kind of slope that they had. So I thought that was great that was just built into the system.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about everyone's favorite maneuver when they first learn to fly, and that's hovering.
Yeah. So as a student, you've gone through this. You know this is frustrating. It can be frustrating, especially as you already knew how to fly. You were quite accomplished. It was probably quite humbling to be put into a helicopter and now hover this thing. It's not easy, right? So there's a few things to be watching out for, but one of the first things I would say is just watching out for the student getting frustrated. If they get frustrated and they start gripping on that cyclic, or they start tensing up, or sometimes they throw the controls away. Your controls, they're done with it, either because they think they're about to crash the helicopter or they're just frustrated. So you got to be real close on the cyclic there. There's no, you shouldn't have any hand anywhere else but close to the cyclic as they learn. But go back to some of the things we've already talked about. Make sure it's over a smooth surface. Be very careful of letting them go backwards when they're learning. It doesn't take much for the aircraft to pick up speed going backwards, and your perspective of height is quite different from where the tail is currently sitting, especially in an R44 longer tail. So give yourself at least 5 foot off the ground to try and learn hovering. Stay close on the pedals. Don't let the student go full left or full right. That can lead to an overspeed, because what will happen is they go full left, and the tail rotor of the 22 and 44 is pretty effective. That's going to spin the aircraft pretty fast. So the nose starts going right. They stomp full left if you let them. And the extra drag in the system brings down the RPM momentarily. So the governor says, I got you, and cranks the throttle open to bring the RPMs up. About that time, the RPMs start coming back up, so the tail rotor thrust increases as well, not just because of the change in pitch on the blade, but you've also added the RPMs back in. It's going to come around hard left. So the next thing they do is full right. And when they do that, they unload the tail rotor and they take out that drag, but the engine's not going to be quick enough to back off. The governor's not going to be quick enough. And so you can get an overspeed just from going full left to full right. They should never go full left to full right. Just stay closer on the pedals there. This goes back to kind of the instructor looking ahead as well. Are we going to a position where we are going to get interference, loss of tail rotor effectiveness kind of areas where the aircraft is likely to start coming right, and just see that how the sequence can start building and being a little bit proactive in blocking, but also advising the student. I think a big part of good hover training is obviously a little bit further along when the student's got some control of the aircraft, is to show them and help them identify those LTE threat areas and hold the aircraft in a hover there and say, hey, we can do this. This tail rotor can do this. I mean, it's been demonstrated up to 17 knots in every direction, up to 9,800 DA. It can do more than that, but that's what it's been demonstrated. So your student might not be there. Of course, I'm not asking you to throw them into that, but make sure they can identify what it feels like on the pedals to be holding that position and anticipate the needs of the pedal work. And then hopefully won't get into too much of the full left, full right stuff. But I'd also say I've recently put out an episode on hover training and making sure we're just building block. We work on pedals first, and then we work on collective, and then pedals and collective, and then cyclic on its own. And we just kind of keep building up whilst mixing in other flight training. You just take student out day one, throw them all 3 controls, and hope it works out. I mean, it'd be great if they did for them. And some students are just amazing. They pick it up within hours. But you're also exposing yourself to a much higher level of risk than you really need to, and a lot of frustration for the student too. So be smart about how you release your student to these different challenges within hovering, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think another thing for CFIs to be aware of is just to have a sense of how tired or fatigued someone is getting from doing a particular maneuver. You're going to get more fatigued more quickly doing hover training, I think, than doing most other things other than maybe auto rotations, I would guess. And so I think it makes sense just to kind of be looking at their face, just try and determine, have they had enough, and is it time to move on and do something different?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about people doing these hard full lefts and hard full rights. I came into helicopter training very conservative, and I think what I found was I was so gentle on the pedals that I didn't realize, when it was time for me to push them fully, there was a lot more travel to them that I could have used than I was using.
Yeah, and it's tricky because the other thing about the pedals is that they act differently in forward flight than they do in hover. It's almost like 2 different aircraft. In forward flight, you can be pretty sloppy and push in plenty of pedal. You could pretend you're flying an airplane if you like. It's okay. you try that in a hover, you're going to spin around 3 times before you know it. So it's like you have to really point this out to a student as, hey, you did great up at altitude, and that's maybe where we started with giving you control isolation. Those pedals, they're a different beast right now in the hover. They're back to this idea of pressure, but when things start spinning, you can keep going till it stops. That's one of the first steps of dealing with LTE is put in as much left pedal as you need to stop it. And I think they found, in a lot of accidents where they could measure amount of pedal input on these LTE accidents, certainly with other aircraft that have data recorders, is often the pilot would be spinning around and never really went all the way travel on that pedal that would have stopped it.
Yeah, and I think that's what I discovered one time with some LTE was, hey, there was still more room for me to keep pushing that pedal, but I was just so worried about, I don't want to over control the controls in this sensitive, delicate helicopter that I'm only going to just gently push a little. It's like, no, actually, that's what you do most of the time, but there is a time and a place for, giving it a lot more input.
Yeah, and it's the same for all the controls, really. I mean, the cyclic, pressure, but then think about a rapid decel, or think about just accelerating from a hover to forward flight. There's a lot of travel there. It's so hard to try and explain to a student small movements, except, hovering, all of it's hard.
Well, I think that's aviation in general. We have so many exceptions to the rule that it's kind of hard to generalize. Well, let's move on and talk about what you tell CFIs about teaching normal and steep approaches. Yeah.
So the main thing I see with normal and steep approaches is, well, there's probably about 3 or 4 things. One goes back to, let's talk about, we're coming into approach. We've lowered the collective. We're on a nice stabilized descent, maybe 200-300 feet per minute. The aircraft's still acting a bit like an airplane coming in to land. And then as we bleed off the airspeed, I use 30 knots as a kind of a call out as the instructor and the student. Everything's going to start changing very quickly as we go below 30 knots. There's already sort of industry rule of thumb that you don't go below 30 knots if you have greater than 300 feet per minute descent rate. So we should already be pre-programmed to use that 30 knots to look at the VSI, look at the vertical speed indicator. And if we have 500 feet per minute, we don't go any slower till we fix that. The other thing about it is, what's the wind doing? Right? We should always know, as we're about to change this thing from an airplane to a helicopter, the wind, as we go below 30, is going to have a big effect on the way this aircraft's going to behave. So we should always be aware, whether that's a windsock or the way the trim strings start to pull across the airframe once we slow down, or the way the tail's twitching, we should be paying attention to that. And that, for the instructor, is when that left foot should start coming up, at least, if not both feet at this point, because this is where the student's going to start being potentially behind on the pedal. Because as we go below 30, next thing we're going to hit is going below ETL, and there's a massive change in performance. We were already losing performance every knot we were going below a VY. So every knot we were going below 53 in the 22, we were getting less performance. But that line is not straight, and we hit ETL and there's a huge decrease and the aircraft starts to settle. So that has 2 problems. One is descent rate. We've got to make sure that because that VSI, it will be seconds before that VSI catches up with what's just really happened. So if you were already at 300 or 350 feet per minute and you let it drop, now you're starting to get close to getting into vortex ring state. So that's one part, is you're ready to pull up the collective if the student's slow on it. But the other piece, of course, is that when the student does pull up on the collective, as they will, to stop the descent, is the engine starts opening the throttle and we get that torque reaction and the aircraft starts spinning to the right. And we've lost that vertical stabilizer assistance coming in as we've got slow. So the aircraft's more wanting to turn anyway. Plus, let's say we weren't paying attention to the wind and we have a left crosswind or whatever it is that's going to affect the way the aircraft's going to react with LT type threats. So be close on the pedal, be close on the bottom of the collective, but also be close on the top of the collective, because as the aircraft starts to settle, the student is often not looking at the manifold pressure. And that's good. They should be looking outside. Certainly when they're starting, there's a lot going on. They need to see what's going out. But they'll just pull and pull and pull. And so what we worry about there is that they'll overpull, will hit low RPM, especially in carb icing conditions where we are already pulling more manifold pressure to compensate for the warmer air coming in with the carb heat. So we're getting closer to that full throttle point, especially spring or late summer thunderstorms, humidity comes down, it's already pretty warm. So we want to make sure we're blocking there and always be ready to go around. And we took, aviation talks about it all the time. You have a song you play every episode of Aviation News Talk. But with the instructor, you have to have all that pre-programmed, which is, if you don't mind, a slight side note here: aviate, navigate, communicate, educate, and those are the order of priorities. So the aviate bit would be taking the controls as necessary, of course. The navigate is not just about cross-country navigation. It's, have you pre-programmed in your head how you're going to do this go around with the helicopters in front of you and the plane that's landing over your left shoulder and the control tower that's off to your right. So you're have all that pre-programmed, so you know in certain situations a go around is very likely. Auto rotations, teaching auto rotations, steep approaches, any approaches with a brand new student, a go around is pretty likely. So you should have already pre-programmed, this is how I'm going to take the controls, this is how I'm going to navigate us out of this trouble, and communicate, not just listening and telling what's going on in the traffic pattern, but communicating to the student, hey, I'm right there with you, or hey, my controls, I need to go around here. I think this is one of those ones where having that open hand with the back of the cyclic being close to your hand, so that if you need to, you can just say, hey, keep moving forward, because as they're pulling up on the collective, another thing they tend to forget is it's also raising the nose, slows us down, performance drops even more. It's this kind of big, as you know, all the little interconnected pieces of bringing the helicopter into a hover. But always be ready to push forward and go around as the instructor. That would be my advice there.
Yeah, going around is one of those things that can just prevent so many accidents. And certainly in the airplane world, we see people just don't do it often enough. For example, on one day in early September, there were 2 jets at 2 different locations, which both ran off the end of the runway. Now, there are probably a dozen overruns per year, but to have 2 on the same day just says, wow, there are 2 pilots on the same day that probably should have gone around.
And maybe a crew of 2 on each, so maybe four pilots involved in that decision making there, maybe.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Go arounds are good practice, and we need to practice them probably more often and just be primed and programmed and ready to do them.
Right.
Well, let's talk about running landings. Those are my favorite because they probably most resemble when I fly in the fixed wing world.
Yes. So running landings, I quite like them. And I do hydraulics off training in the R44, where we often will use the running landing because it's a safer way to bring it down instead of trying to hover it. And I kind of enjoy them. But I know for a lot of students, they really don't like them. They struggle with them. It seems wrong to be coming down with so much speed and smacking this thing down onto the runway or the taxiway with no wheels on it. But the part of that is how you train, which I can talk about in a second, and how you kind of stage that. But there's some things to always be doing with any student, no matter what their level is. And the first one is every approach you should be briefing the wind. We already covered that, and on final, because it may have changed while you're on downwind. These light and variable winds are moving around, but we need to say, hey, we got a left crosswind here, or hey, we got a right tailwind here. So now we're going to have a much faster ground run, and we're going to be pushed off to the right, or to the left. And make sure we're not allowing the aircraft to set down off center line. If you have a left crosswind, you might think, well, maybe I should land upwind of the center line to offset that. Well, that would be great if it always goes the way the wind blows, but it doesn't, and you've just taken away your margin on the left side now. You should really be aiming for center line, and then you have safe margins on both sides, but you've preloaded your head. The wind is probably going to push you off to the right, for example. So that's one thing. The other thing is to be close on both pedals. Make sure, again, we do not want the student to foul up the pedal left-right when you're already moving 20 knots down the runway on the runway or on the taxiway. Another one is blocking aft cyclic. We don't want the student to come back with the cyclic thinking that they can use it as a brake after touchdown. And that can cause, especially if the aircraft's bouncing around and the tail boom's coming up, and they can cause contact with the tail boom there. So make sure you're covering that. And there's a few other things. The other thing is this death grip can come back as well. The student can get a little bit tense with this maneuver, and I've seen it even with brand new instructors that come into new hire training, and inadvertently they are gripping the throttle a little bit as they touch down. And what that tends to do is once we make contact, they continue to lower the collective, and the engine and rotor will come down. If it comes down, if the collective comes down quite quickly, the collective has a little micro switch, and when the collective is all the way down, it disables the low RPM warning system. So you may not even hear a low RPM horn, but the RPMs come down. And the problem with that is it gives us less main rotor thrust, which we're going to use with the cyclic to control the drift, and less tail rotor thrust, which we're going to use to control direction. And it changes the torque reaction. So it's going to start causing the aircraft to yaw because of the change in torque reaction too. So watch out for that. And even after we've stopped and everything's come to a standstill, one thing that unfortunately we've seen is a student will sometimes, in their mind, they think they've just done a full down landing where they've done an auto rotation where they've closed the throttle to idle and they've done a touchdown with the idle throttle, or maybe they think they've done a hover auto in their mind because it felt pretty rough on set down, and without thinking, they roll the throttle up, and we're already at 100%, and we instantly overspeed the engine and rotor. So some things there to be making sure that you train students to never roll up without looking at the tacks. We have a phrase we use, eyes to the tacks, and that way the student looks at the tacks. Oh, I'm already at 100%, and we hopefully don't roll up, or we do it. We pay attention to that. But the other thing in terms of control inputs that we want to be careful of, there's two other things really. One is when the aircraft is slowing down on a running landing. So the first part of the running landing, left and right cyclic, is your main directional control, and we don't really pay attention to the pedals very much, other than trying to keeping it in line with the center line as before touchdown. And if your student, say for example, the nose starts to go right just prior to touchdown, and you say more left, come left, and they put left cyclic in, you go straight into dynamic rollover because you're a foot or so off the ground. They came left cyclic where your nose was already right, traveling, down the runway. And as you came left cyclic, you lose some of that vertical lift. The aircraft settles straight onto the left skid. So you should always be specific, left cyclic, left pedal, but it really matters with this maneuver as we start changing how the aircraft is typically moved around. Students, again, there's new students are still trying to work out, do I move the aircraft left and right with a cyclic here, or is this a pedal turn? So be careful of that. And then one last thing I've already talked about a little bit is when you make contact and you're sliding down the runway, if you start drifting right and you put left cyclic in, the disc tilts left. And as long as you're still producing lift, it creates a horizontal component of left, and it will drag the helicopter back towards center line. But if you touch down and immediately lower the collective flat pitch, you have very, very little thrust on that main rotor now. You will still move the disc, but you're not creating the kind of thrust you need to actually have some input. There's an accident that I looked at that was exactly kind of this, where the student had put collective all the way down and gone full left and nothing was happening, and it won't, because there's no thrust. So I'm just saying that when you touch down, if you're tracking center line, sure, continue to smoothly lower it all the way down. If you're drifting, once you touch down, don't lower it all the way down until you have some control of the track, the ground track. And I'm not saying leave it light on the skids, but don't dump it all the way down either, or your cyclic does nothing. So keep that in mind.
Well, as you talk about all these gotchas, I think I'm becoming less and less a fan of the running landings. It sounds like there are even more gotchas there than I had realized.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a great maneuver. I think it's rarely used in reality, but it has some good applications. And the way I get the instructors to teach it is to show them the first one, the full, this is what we're going to get when you get this down. But then to take them off to a taxiway and just start with a 2-foot hover, walking forward, get the student just to gently touch down with some forward movement, and then build up speed from there and height, speed and height. And eventually we get to above ETL, maybe about 20 feet, where we actually want to try to maintain about ETL to touchdown. So little building blocks. We don't go straight to, now your turn, let's do a 5-minute turn in the pattern and you crash this thing into the ground and I take the controls again and we do it again, So,
well, along those lines, talk about an aborted running landing. What should CFIs be thinking about if it's not working out and they need to abort the maneuver?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was, to illustrate the point of why we need to be careful with this, there was an accident in 2013 in Florida where, I already talked about it a little bit, the aircraft touches down, they're tracking sideways, they have full left cyclic, collective fully down, it's not working. So then the instructor decides, I'm going to pick this thing up before we run off the runway, and we're still tracking forward. And he raised the collective, but he hadn't centered the cyclic. And he went straight into a dynamic rollover and rolled the helicopter up. And next thing he knows, he's waking up upside down. So it is with caution. You have to think about aborting a running landing. I would say if you're going to do it, make sure you have plenty of time. If you feel rushed, you are going to over control and potentially roll the aircraft over. I would say focus on centering the cyclic and not just taking out, because you're probably on the stops. You're probably full right or full left. So you'll feel like you probably brought it back towards center, but you probably haven't. I've seen it plenty of times in the aircraft, in the sim. The instructor, and even myself, has not come to the center that I think I have. So maybe you can glance down for a second and see where you're at. But if you're running out of black top and you're about to go off, you don't want to rush this one. You'd be better off taking the controls, getting the aircraft pointing to the gravel, and you have an embarrassing slide off. It's not like an airplane where we're going to blow a tire and hopefully we'll pick it up and no one will see and we'll hover off and go fly again. But if you do have to do this, we train instructors on this. We don't let them just work it out. And we say, hey, we're going to go in the sim. We're going to make the surface very slick. We'll come in high speed, diagonally across the runway. I'll play the role of the student. I'll put full cyclic in, flat pitch. You take the controls and you have to center this and safely bring us up without flipping us over. I've had to do this a couple of times in the 10 years or whatever that I've been flying, and it's nerve-wracking. And other times I've had to. It was hydraulics off. Was one of these ones where we're coming towards the edge. I don't trust myself being able to pull this thing safely back up into the ground. Hydraulics off as we were snapping it into hover. So we took the gravel. So yeah, be very, very, very careful and practice this in the sim if you have access to it before you try this for the first time, I would say.
So if one is doing a running landing on hard surface runway, for example, how late can you abort the maneuver? Can you actually be sliding on the ground and still go around successfully at that point, or should you commit yourself to staying on the ground?
No, you can. You can if you've got the width and the time. But just don't get yourself there. If you've got yourself not straight down and you're already past the center line and the wind's coming from the right or whatever, all these things combining, don't let the student touch down. I mean, you may have had this experience yourself where you may have bounced and come back up on a running landing. But the difference with that is you were not already full cyclic left or full cyclic right, which is what will happen once you set down and you try to stop that slide. Also knowing that by not lowering the collective all the way down, you do have some control. If you forgot that and the collective's all the way down, you're along for the ride, unless your instructor grabs the controls, brings the collective up a little bit to get some thrust in the main rotor, or if that's not working, has time to center control safely and bring the aircraft in. It's a running takeoff, basically, which is a separate maneuver, but sometimes you get to combine the two. Just do it very, very carefully.
Yeah, indeed. That's how I try to fly in general, is very, very carefully. Well, we're going to do a part 2, but just to wrap this up, let's talk about the shutdown. What do CFIs and helicopter pilots need to know about the shutdown?
Yeah, so I fly with these instructors. There are 200 hours or all the way up to 1,000 hours where I'm doing a lot of internal training. And I never leave the helicopter or take my hand off the throttle until this first step is completed correctly. And that's the roll down. So we've landed, all the stress comes out, we relax for a second, but as the instructor, keep your left hand on that throttle. We're 100%. We need to make sure that student says something like eyes to the tack so that you know that they're looking, and they slowly start rolling in what they believe is the correct direction. So it gives you and them time to catch it if it's not, if they're rolling up. And then they and they come all the way down. It's such an easy way to break a helicopter, and pretty badly too. If you set down, collective down, first step is a memory item, so it's not a checklist item, is, roll that throttle down, they roll the wrong way, boom, done. Engine, rotor, gearbox. So just as the instructor, never ever let your guard down at this point. And teach your student too. It's like, hey, this is one of the times where it's really easy for you to destroy this helicopter. So let's always use that technique. Eyes to the tack, thumb down, roll down, nice and slow. We're going in the right direction. Good. Let's continue from there.
Yeah, and there's an analogy in the fixed wing world, which is that pilots, after they land and they start to taxi, they feel this sense of relief. The hard part's done. This is the easy part. All I need to do now is just taxi back. What could possibly go wrong? And I can tell you, for one of the clubs that I've flown with for many years, fully 50% of the insurance claim come from those taxiing and ground type incidents. And so, yeah, same thing. I'm sure helicopter pilots kind of feel like, oh, we got the skids on the ground. Now I can heave this sigh of relief and the hard part's over. And you make a good point. Nope, there are still ways to screw things up.
Yeah, and that's a big one. And so that's, for me, that's the last big concern. But as you've probably been told, you're still flying that helicopter till the blades have stopped, essentially. So you shut down the engine. I know this is a little bit off topic here, but you shut down the engine gets quiet. This is the time that people walk up to helicopters. So keep your guard up, keep your eyes outside, fly that helicopter till the blades are stopped. I see people with heads down, writing numbers down, no idea that someone's walking towards the helicopter. So no delay, the 30 seconds that you're supposed to do, then get on the rotor brake, stay focused. Now the aircraft's safe. Now we can truly calm, relax. We're not flying anymore. Aviation is not very forgiving of mistakes. We all know that.
Now, and part of the fun is that we operate in such a dynamic environment that things are constantly changing. And even if you do everything perfectly the same way you did on the last flight, that might not be appropriate for this particular flight. So we have to keep our head in the game throughout the entire flight. Well, before we go, tell us a little bit about your helicoptertrainingvideos.com website.
Yeah, so I started as an instructor about, 15 years ago, whatever it was. Back then, there really wasn't anything for helicopter students. There was a lot of stuff for fixed wing, and there always has been. So I started putting out some videos. One of the very first videos I did was on the S-File 73, what was called awareness training back then, and trying to have some reference for people trying to get a bit more information. And from there, it's been a volunteer project that I've been doing throughout all the jobs I've been doing in industry. Sometimes I have more time than others, and it's kind of gone up and down with the amount of time that I have to commit to it. But it's all for helicopter students and instructors or anyone who wants to learn about helicopters. It's free videos and articles and some quizzes and whatnot. And more recently, the podcast, the helicopter training podcast, a couple of episodes out there, the first one being answering a lot of those questions, like how do I become a helicopter pilot? It's a long, each one's about an hour. There's a lot going on in there, but and then the second one was hovering. It's all about all the questions you might have. How do I hover? How do I teach hovering? How do I safely teach hovering? So some of the stuff we've sort of talked about is covered in that one too. And the next one will probably be auto rotations, which I think is another one of those big topics that people have a lot of questions about, and as an instructor and as a student, and struggles. And so that's kind of what I want to do, is just like you, put out education to keep things safe and help people progress through their career in aviation, particularly helicopters for me.
And I found your website when I was working on my private helicopter add-on, and I watched a number of the videos, and I found it was just a great resource. And part of why I was looking for these kinds of things is I'm a firm believer that one can greatly reduce the amount of money they spend on flight training and achieve their objectives more rapidly if they don't just consider flight training as the time when they're at the airport with the Hobbs meter running. Yeah, that's the most expensive part, and that should probably be 20% of what you do for flight training. All that other time, be researching between flights, learn as much as you can, and that's really, I think, going to make people a more successful helicopter pilot. And I think you've got a great resource there. So thanks so much for putting that out there for people.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, the website is helicoptertrainingvideos.com. Jay, thanks so much for joining us here today, and we'll see you again real soon.
It's my pleasure. I can't wait. Speak to you soon. That's it for part 1. That pretty much wraps up episode 3 of the Helicopter Train podcast. Please send your feedback and questions. How was your training? Did you have any interesting mistakes that the instructor had to save the day? Or as an instructor, any stories or tips to share? Send it to us either as a written message or record a quick audio at helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. And as always, all the links or videos mentioned in this episode are in the episode show notes in your podcast player or the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Watch out for the next episode, which will be part 2 in this 3-part series. There we'll be covering rapid decels or quick stops, vortex ring state, and hover autos. So send in your questions or ideas or tips for that episode, and don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you get that episode when it comes out. Thank you for tuning in to the Helicopter Train podcast. So if you found this episode useful, please take a moment, rate and review the show in your podcast app, because those reviews and ratings make a huge difference helping others discover the show and grow the community. Please also just share the podcast with any friends or colleagues or anyone else you think would be passionate about helicopters. Don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you never miss a future episode. And we'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, topic suggestions, or want to share your experiences, your frustrations, and your successes, head out to helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. Your feedback really helps improve the show, make each episode even better. Finally, if you found value in this podcast, please visit helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/support. And there you can find a bunch of ways to support the show, both financially and otherwise, to help the show keep going. Thanks again for listening. Fly safe, and we'll see you on the next episode.